Roman was brought up in Sydney and Hong Kong, and now lives in Oxford. Has studied at a number of universities, including Oxford and Essex, and is a cultural thinker, author, and writer about empathy. So the book's called Empathy: A Handbook for a Revolution. What is empathy, and what is the revolution?
Core questions. Yes. So empathy is the art of stepping into the shoes of another person and understanding their feelings, their perspectives, and then using that to guide your actions. And it's something, of course, that all comes naturally to us. If you're walking along here on this morning down the Strand, you pass someone selling the big issue, you may not just feel sorry for somebody, which is pity or sympathy, you might actually be doing a bit of empathizing, trying to understand, well, what's it like to be out selling the big issue in the rain, or sleeping rough, or having someone walk past you without looking you in the eye. And that skill is something that 98% of us have, say the neuroscientists. There's been a scientific kind of revolution which has made us understand that we are homo empathicus. We are wired not just for self-interest and individualism, but also for empathy and cooperation and mutual aid. So there's a question of, okay, well, let's say we're born with empathy and we develop it early in childhood, but then what's this revolution idea? Why does there need to be a revolution? And I think, for me, if I look at the world around me, I see a world of excessive hyper-individualism. There's good data from the United States showing that empathy levels are dropping, have dropped nearly 50% in the last 40 years, the steepest decline in the last 10 years. In Britain, we see similar things happening, massive decline of social trust, sort of associated phenomena. And I think we need empathy to try and help us bridge social divides, to help expand our moral concern, whether it's caring about education standards in developing countries, or child poverty in our own, or climate change, stepping into the shoes of future generations.
So I see the problem, but the question is, what is the revolution?
The key thing to get about empathy is that it's not just a relationship about individuals, not just about me stepping into your shoes and vice versa and creating a bit of mutual understanding. Empathy can also be a mass or collective phenomena that shifts the social and political landscape. And in fact, that is the story of human history in the past 1,000 years. I think of the last 1,000 years not just as a time of changes of government or religions and civilizations coming and going, technological change, but periods of mass empathic flowering and, of course, mass empathic collapse. Now, we all learn about the moments of collapse, the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, the Crusades, and so on. But there's also been these moments where empathy has flowered and created extraordinary social change. Just to give you a couple of examples. In the late 18th century, there was in Britain the rise of the first human rights movement, the mass movement against slavery and the slave trade. And that was very much powered by empathy. The leaders of that campaign, Quakers and others, they tried to get members of the British public to step into the shoes of slaves on slave ships or in the Caribbean. They printed a famous poster called the Brooks slave ship, showing how many slaves could be fit into a slave ship. And of course, this was a time when 500,000 slaves were being worked to death on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, on British colonies. They got former slaves to come and give public talks and so on. And all of this led to mass petitioning, lobbying, government, eventually led to shifts of policy. Equally in the Second World War, during evacuation, a lot of people forget that one of the things that happened with evacuation, where over 1 million children were sent to foster homes, is not only was it often a traumatic experience for children, but it revealed the social black spots in British society to people, because basically relatively poor working class kids were thrust into the homes of relatively well-off provincial households. And suddenly there was almost the greatest meeting of strangers in British history. And what people don't learn about at school is that this led to a new swathe of child welfare legislation in response, because there was public protest and so on. So when it comes to the revolution, what I mean is that there's the potential to harness empathy on this mass scale to tackle problems like inequality and so on.
And what you're saying is those kinds of moments, like the anti-slavery movement, that you could turn those into a program for changing the way our society works. Is that what you're advocating?
Yeah, that's part of it. I think on a more conceptual level, what we need to understand is something about how social change happens, which is that what empathy does is that in general, it opens the door of our moral concern for previously neglected groups, and then rights and laws come along and wedge that door open. Yeah. That's the story of social change as I see it. And all over the world, we can see areas where this kind of process could be happening. I mean, there's a very interesting organization in Israel and Palestine called the Parent Circle, which tries to create empathy on this kind of mass level for exactly these social change purposes. So they do projects, for example, a recent one was called the Hello Peace telephone line that some of you might know about, where it was a free phone telephone line that any Israeli could call this free phone number, and they were put through to a Palestinian stranger who could talk to them for up to half an hour about anything, and a Palestinian could call this free phone number and talk to an Israeli. And in its first 5 years of operation, over 1 million calls were made on the Hello Peace phone line. And this is the kind of projects and processes I'm talking about that I think can...
And so the basic insight there is that once you've actually been in dialogue with somebody, it's much harder to... It's easier to feel empathy. You're less likely to feel destructive or negative towards somebody. So the human contact, whether it's through a phone line or student exchanges or whatever, all those kinds of things would make a big difference.
Yeah, I think if you think about, well, how do you actually get better at empathy? One of the ways is through conversation. You know, you talk to somebody, you see their perspective, it changes you. A second route is through experience, where you actually experience a little bit of somebody else's life. But another way I think we can, or something to understand about empathy, is that literally just the act of imagining yourself in someone else's position changes our behavior. You know, this week there's reports that Michael Gover's cutting To Kill a Mockingbird off the GCSE English literature syllabus. And of course that is a book all about empathy. The central line, you know, is all about, you know, you never really understand another person until you step inside of his skin and walk around in it for a while. And I've recently found a project called the Empathy Library, which is an online library of books and films that anybody can join, full of videos, shorts, novels, and so on, all about empathy, that you can read reviews and ratings and so on. And you know, in a way, when I think about empathy education, I think we need to be curating the kind of knowledge that's out there. I mean, in this case, you know, it's empathy. You find it at the Empathy Library, but of course, empathy education needs to be happening in schools and universities and elsewhere.
What would you do differently in the daily experience of a primary school student if you wanted to bring about the revolution you're advocating?
There are all sorts of great models out there for empathy education. So we know, for example, like I think you spoke to Mary Gordon from Roots of Empathy. You know, most of you probably know that, sort of Ashoka-related project where a baby comes into the classroom and teaches empathy. And I think that's probably the best documented in terms of its effects, its impact on students, that project. So what would I see different? I'd partly like to see things like Roots of Empathy rolled out across schools. We know that Roots of Empathy is in Scotland in every Scottish authority, not in every school, but in every authority there are schools doing Roots of Empathy. I'd look to models like the International Baccalaureate's primary school program, which puts empathy and other things like, you know, respect and tolerance at the core of the curriculum. So not long ago I went to the Amsterdam International School, which uses the primary school program, the IB primary school program, and there's a class of sort of 10 and 11-year-olds, and they were doing a whole term around the themes of empathy, respect and tolerance. So they were learning science and maths and history through the lens of empathy and things like that, and I thought that was fantastic. So I'd like to see that kind of program. The third thing I'd like to see is something that I think is modeled very well by the United World College movement, which is the community service aspect that they have, where if you go to United World College School in Singapore, every week the students are going to 80 different community organizations doing hands-on work with people who are, the elderly or other kinds of deprived groups. And of course, that community action is a way of building empathy.
Does anybody want to take the dialogue? Any points you want to make, arguments you want to raise, or just questions? Yes, your question.
Can you talk about the neuroscience of empathy?
Probably a lot of you have heard about mirror neurons, these neurons in the brain which fire not just when you feel pain, but when you see somebody else in pain. Now, the argument is that when these mirror neurons were discovered at University of Parma around 1990, that this was telling us something about empathy, that this is where empathy comes from. It's how you feel what somebody else feels. You see somebody's thumb jammed in a door, you feel that too. Now, I think there's been a big a lot of exaggeration about the mirror neurons. Steven Pinker's very good at writing about this, that they're seen as, that's all that empathy is about. I think the sort of current research really is a bit broader than that, which says that we have probably a multi-section empathy circuit in our brains. Simon Baron-Cohen from University of Cambridge talks about a 10-section empathy circuit in our brains, and that if you damage part of that circuit, then you might lose your ability, for example, to recognize fear or other emotions on somebody else's face. But this is definitely, it is extraordinary the amount of research now on empathy in the brain, and there's sort of seems no doubt in my mind that this is, core to who we are. Though it's not only neuroscience which tells us that we are empathic. You see it amongst 2-year-olds. I see my twins. I've got twins, right? And you see how empathy develops in children very, very, very clearly. So like when my boy-girl twins were 1.5 years old, say before the empathy kicked in when they were 2, if my son was crying, his sister would try and comfort him with her favorite toy dog, which was not much use to him. But fast forward a year when they were 2.5, when the sort of empathic brain had developed more, when my son was crying, his sister would go and comfort him with his favorite toy cat. And that's the cognitive leap of empathy. Stepping into someone else's shoes.
You touched on the generational issues slightly, and I just wondered if, in the work you've done, if you observe differences in how other age groups, and not necessarily students, but adults, approach empathy, and does that have a bearing on how you teach it? It's
not clear that there is any definite relationship between the life course and empathy development. Right? I don't think there are any sort of necessary clear stages. What I do see is this, is that children have it born into them and bred into them through good parenting, ideally, and then it gets crushed. It gets crushed by culture. It gets crushed by racism, authority relationships, nationalism, all sorts of things put borders on our moral universes. And I think we need to be, in a way, trying to get beyond all those kinds of barriers. So what you see, one of the reasons I spend so much time talking about empathy is that I think we've all got it in us, but we need to be shifting culture, society, politics, education in order to bring it back out, that latent empathic potential which is in all of us. So that as adults we have the capacity to grasp, but it doesn't mean though we can't, there's a lot of new research on brain plasticity, how we can rewire our brains as adults as well through conversation, experience, other kinds of learning, so we can get better at empathy as we get older. The sociologist Karl Mannheim famously talked about how our world views are shaped by generations. You have a generation that's gone through the First World War, they have certain experiences. And of course now we have generations going through, for example, the rise of social networks. And there's a question, well, how do those, how does online digital culture affect our capacity for empathy? Well, we know there's growing research showing that the more Facebook interactions you have, the more narcissistic you're likely to be, right? That's telling us something about the capacity for empathy. On the other hand, we have projects like your interfaith kind of dialogues using online technologies showing that, well, there are huge possibilities that need to be tapped into. I'm still looking for the ultimate empathy app. I don't think anybody's quite developed it yet, because most apps, of course, and social networking are designed to get you in contact with people who are like you. And I'd like to see the apps for getting you into touch with people who are not like you.
We've talked a lot about how you could teach empathy in schools, whether primary or higher education, but I wonder what role businesses can play, and whether once you start a job, you can kind of become living in a bubble and specialise.
It's really interesting. I think this is a double-edged sword, actually. On the one hand, you get lots of companies talking about empathy marketing, that we need to step into the shoes of our customers in order to understand them better. Well, on some level, that's stepping into somebody else's shoes in order just to sell them another pair, right? I don't particularly want fast food companies to get better at stepping into the shoes of my children to sell them more hamburgers and send them on a fast track to heart disease. I think where empathy is important on the business level is in the functioning of organizations. And certainly Ashoka's done a lot of work on this, and Bill Drayton, about how if you want to work with anybody else, you need to be exquisitely attuned to those people around you. Empathy is the cornerstone of cooperation in organizations of any kind, of course, in families as well. And that ability is something that we certainly need to be nurturing. And if you don't have it, it's very difficult to function. I mean, certainly there's evidence that you can get to the top of the corporate tree by having no empathy at all and being completely Machiavellian, but I think most of us are having to work with other people. And certainly our education systems don't foster that kind of cooperative, empathic understanding, and they should do, because we all need it.
Do you think that we need to focus on the things that destroy empathy? Because we started off the conversation by saying actually there's been a massive decline. And so is it worth focusing on the negatives and trying to stop those, or do we just focus on the positives?
Okay, I think it's really important to think about the different kinds of barriers to empathy and recognize exactly what they are and which ones are the biggest ones, and try and tackle them head on. Certainly, yeah, things like, on some level it seems that nationalism is, in historical terms, on decline in some way. There are more global citizens in this room than there may have been 30 years ago, and certainly sort of empathy scholars like Jeremy Rifkin, wrote a book called The Empathic Civilization. His view is that empathy is gradually sort of expanding. It's quite a kind of progressive linear view, that we started with empathy, in the tribe, in the community, in the nation state. We're now moving to global empathic consciousness, maybe to empathy with, animals and the planet itself. I think that's way too simplistic. I think empathy comes and goes. There are moments of empathic collapse, like the war in the former Yugoslavia, Rwandan genocide. I think the empathy gains of one generation are never guaranteed, and they have to be fought for.
And do you think you are making progress? Just a last point.
Well, I left academia about a dozen years ago. I used to be a lecturer in sociology and politics, and to dedicate myself to empathy, because I didn't think you could study it in any particular subject area. There wasn't the space for it. And when I first started giving public talks on empathy, nobody was really interested. But now, every day, every week, I'm getting asked by advertising agencies or governments or NGOs, whatever, to come and talk about empathy. To me, that's a sign that there's been an absolute extraordinary revolution in our thinking. It is amazing, the shift that's going on. For 300 or 400 years, we've had the view that human nature is basically self-interested. And that is being turned on its head. That view is now more or less seen as old-fashioned. So I think the empathy revolution is on us, and we need to ride the wave.
So thank you very much indeed for your
Thank
time.
you all for your questions and thoughts.